International news now, and all eyes will be on Washington this coming week as the United States prepares to host its inaugural G20 Sherpas meeting on Monday and Tuesday. These high-level discussions are crucial for setting and refining the agenda for the country's year-long presidency of the forum, which will culminate in a G20 Leaders Summit in Miami, Florida, later next year. However, the start of these critical talks is already overshadowed by a significant diplomatic controversy, the confirmed exclusion of South Africa from the proceedings. Pretoria has now confirmed that it has written to the rest of the G20 countries and nation blocs, requesting them to make their objection known over South Africa's exclusion, despite being one of the founding members of the G20. Let's bring in former diplomat and conflict resolution expert, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, as well as political analyst and director of the Northwest University School of Governance, Professor Kedibone Phago. Good afternoon to the both of you. Dr. Makhubela, let me start with you. Can the United States do this? Can it say that there's a G20 made up of 19 sovereign states, 2 country blocs, but we unilaterally are saying this one country out of the 19 will not take part, whatever the format of the presidency handover and transition, troika, we care for none of that. They absolutely will not be taking part.
Good afternoon, Tula Sizwe. Good afternoon, Prof. The question, Tula Sizwe, should rather be, is the United States allowed to do this? If this question is phrased in that manner, the United States is not allowed to do this. It's not empowered to unilaterally exclude a member from participating in any form of the meetings of the Group of 20. Of course, the United States can use its own unilateral power to exclude a member. And in this case, they've done that. They've written a note verbal to the South African government informing them that they are not invited to any of the meetings, including the meeting that begins tomorrow of the Sherpa, even any other groups, including the meetings of the ministers and the summit. So they've officially communicated to South Africa. And South Africa has correctly responded by writing a note to the rest of the members of the G20 to place this on record of the Sherpas that begins tomorrow in Washington, D.C., to raise an objection. And it's a principal argument, if you look at South Africa's statement, that they're going to raise this on the principle of a member state taking a unilateral decision to exclude another member from participating. And this as a precedent setting, which is the uncharted territory. And I think the approach that South Africa has taken is quite correct.
Yeah. Professor Phago, weigh in on that. What are the implications of the exclusion of South Africa if we think of what the G20 was all about, economies of significance, you know, in their particular regions and how they relate to the global economy? The global South, its representation, it continues because there are countries of the global South, but is Africa's voice weakened by the exclusion of South Africa despite the presence of the AU?
Tulas, and good afternoon to Dr. Makhubela as well. So the issue of excluding Africa is really at the core of this, I think. And for me, Tulas, the Trump administration has been very clear from inception that they are going to disrupt a lot of multilateral arrangements. So the target is not only at the G20, but many other multilateral platforms, especially for the developing countries. And my view is that Trump's administration has a very strong strategy on this. So I don't think this is an ad hoc arrangement. I think it's a very clear targeted strategy on disrupting multilateralism, but also making sure that the developing nations are not going to see an advancement in their economy and in their economies. And the G20 is one platform that allows many of the developing countries platform to interact and make trade deals. So it is, I think, on this basis that the US presidency currently is taking that approach. So I think the one part is if South Africa is excluded, it will definitely disrupt uh, Africa's access to a lot of markets through G20. But the other part is it would, in my view, seem that it is in the interest of Trump's administration that G20, because it has accommodated a lot of developing countries, must actually be somehow paralyzed. And I think either way, he will emerge as a winner. If the G20 does not take place, he will be getting what he wants. If the G20 takes place without South Africa, he will be the winner still. So I think he has, on that basis, hashed a very strong strategy.
Dr. Makhubela, knowing what we know about the positions of various countries, especially from the European, countries and European bloc, what their positions are about the inclusivity of the G20, as well as the widened agenda that no longer has to do with just the finance track. How spirited do we expect this objection to be? Could it be so spirited as to almost stymie progress in refining and shaping the G20 presidency of the United States and what their agenda items are until this matter is resolved?
Tula Sizwe, the Sherpas are meant to guide the leaders to reach consensus. That's why the term Sherpa actually comes from the Himalaya people. These are people who assist the mountain climbers to reach the summit. And when they adopted this terminology of Sherpa was to help leaders to navigate often very complex and difficult strategic global issues. So the Sherpas meeting will set the tone between tomorrow and day after tomorrow. I think we should watch the space and see what comes out of that. But what is concerning Tula Sizwe is that the objection that has been raised about the exclusion of South Africa is dealt with by most other member states at a very lower level. It's only the German Chancellor who has raised his voice personally and indicated that he's likely to take up the matter with President Trump. But if you look at the three thematic issues of the United States, these are very, very problematic issues to reach consensus on. I mean, look at the very first one where they are really looking at reaching consensus on the development of economy and doing away with what they call regulatory hurdles. This is going to be a huge problem to navigate. The issue around pioneering new technologies, they're going to need South Africa. I think as they discuss this, they're going to realize that they need the voices of the developing country. Even the question of, unlocking the supply chain of global energy, cheap global energy. So these three themes are a minefield for the United States without the involvement of the developing countries, particularly the African countries. And in this case, South Africa. The AU has no mandate compared to the EU to represent member states and speak on behalf of member states because there's no consensus around these issues. As opposed to the EU, there are issues that are delegated to the EU Council, so they can deal with those issues. But in this case, it means the voice of Africa will be left out, definitely.
Prof. Phago, what have you made of South Africa's response to these, moves to exclude it, not just from the Sherpas meeting, but from all meetings, really? That's the indication from the United States, from all meetings during the US's presidency of the G20. South Africa's response has been to say, we are not going to call on the other members to boycott the G20 and all its activities, but we are going to ask them to register their dissatisfaction and raise this and raise it quite sharply. What do you make of that strategy? Is it likely to lead to a resolution of this matter?
Look, Tulas, it will still depend on whether the host, the US, has the intention to accommodate any voice, dissenting voice in this case from South Africa, to try and make sure that it participates in the G20 as a founding member. So I think there is absolutely no reason to think that South Africa's voice should be undermined in any way. And I have a very strong sense, reading or listening to many other countries, that it is something that is highly unprecedented. And I think many of the G20 members, to a very large extent, I think are still formulating a response. But the other very critical element here, Tulas, is that US has been a leading this unipolar world for since the Second World War in 1945. And post the Cold War, to a very large extent, that it has been highly, highly dominant, dominating all these other trade deals and global economies, and funding, all of this, many of these global arrangements. The rise of China and these multilateral platforms have actually shook US to its shoes. And many of these reactions, especially from the Trump presidency, have not really been subtle. And this is very overt, and that we need to really look closely into this story as it unfolds on what will it bring about, because I cannot think that many of the G20 are going to agree that South Africa should be left out, for the simple reason that there are many countries on the G20 platforms and many other multilateral platforms that have differences. And so if we are going to use this kind of platforms that it is time to settle scores, it will definitely collapse a lot of our global consensus and multilateral platforms.
All right, I've got to leave it there. Professor Phago, Kedibone Phago, as well as Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, weighing in ahead of the first meeting of the Sherpas in the United States under the United States presidency of the G20.